My name is Graem Castell. I'm 20 years into writing an epic memoir, brimming with other material. Born of British parents in Singapore in 1939, shortly before the start of the Second World War, my very early childhood included escaping from the Japanese invasion of Malaya in December 1942 and finding refuge in wartime Australia and India. As a 19 and 20-year-old, straight from 10 years at rather nice boarding schools in post-war England, I served as a Gurkha officer in the jungles of Malaya, now Malaysia, soldiering with those incredible human beings, the legendary Gurkhas, was one of the most moving experiences of my life. In my early 20s, my mid-20s, in 1965, I opened an immensely successful restaurant on King's Road, Chelsea, the epicenter of 1960s swinging London. Shortly afterwards, I opened 2 more in London and 1 on a Mediterranean island. In my early 30s, still on a roll, I started on a personal transformational journey that included, among much else, completely abandoning my ultra-comfortable lifestyle, my home, my businesses, everything, right down to the last penny of my considerable wealth, and founding a spiritually based, intentional community on the Scottish island of Iona.
That was Graem Castell introducing himself and his action-packed memoir, Feet of Clay. This is Writers Radio. I'm Ingrid Rose, your host for our program, also titled Feet of Clay. If you get a slightly sinking feeling, have no fear. This is perhaps one of the most buoyant life stories I've heard. Along with introducing himself, Graem reads from chapter 1 of his memoir.
Now, aged 86 in 2025, I'm savoring an adventure-filled life, sharing in my book at least some of the insights that have made that life so fulfilling, and observing the illusory world in which we live, a world seemingly in turmoil. I and my all-Canadian wife have lived in Vancouver, British Columbia since 1990. There's a very short but relevant statement at the outset of my memoir. I had it all. In due course, I abandoned that all and stepped into the void. Chapter 1. Kota Bharu, Malaya, The Invasion, December the 8th, 1941. The shelling came from beyond the swath of coconut palms that separated our garden from a silvery beach and the moonlit darkness of the South China Sea, a reverberating cacophony emanating, it seemed, from every direction at once. Flares lit up the sky. It was shortly after midnight. We huddled in our nightclothes on one of the chintz-covered sofas on the drawing room veranda. My mother, calm and reassuring as ever, with her long brown hair falling to her shoulders, released from its usual modish bun, my younger brother Walter, 20 months old, and me, 1 month short of my 3rd birthday. Our Chinese ama, a treasure as my mother described her, hovered anxiously in the background. At that moment, my father burst onto the veranda. A little over 6 feet tall, solidly built and balding since his early 20s, he was grim-faced and tense. His horn-rimmed glasses were slightly askew. He'd been on the telephone continuously since the shelling started, somehow struggling into his clothes while juggling 2 of those clunky braided cord telephones. "It is the Japanese, damn it," he announced. "They'll be attempting a landing shortly." The thought that it might have been the army, our army, rehearsing, was now laid to rest. We were finally into the Second World War.
I'm trying to imagine what that was like to find as a child. I mean, you were just 3 or barely when the war started, and there the Japanese invaded. Your father was in the position, he was obviously engaged in fighting.
My father was the state treasurer of one of the Malay states in the top right-hand corner of Malaya, which just happened to be the exact spot where the Japanese landed 6,000 strong invasion force, literally within minutes, within less than an hour of the Japanese also hitting Pearl Harbor, later Hong Kong, other targets in the Southeast Asian region.
Were you airlifted out?
No, the planes hardly existed in those days, and they certainly didn't carry more than 1 or 2 people. My mother and my younger brother and I scuttled down the length of Malaya to Singapore, and shortly after got a ship to Australia as being a safe haven, because it was obvious by then that the Japanese were deadly serious. I mean, everybody knew about Pearl Harbor. They were bombing Singapore, and they already landed in Malaya and were driving back the forces. My father, as a senior government officer, left shortly afterwards. He had to shoot the dogs because we didn't want them to fall into Japanese hands. He couldn't shoot the polo ponies because there wasn't time. He made his way down to Singapore by his own means. And 2 days before Singapore fell, the biggest military collapse in the British Empire's history, he had permission to evacuate Singapore and had all sorts of valuable paperwork with him to try and get to India, the safety of India. The convoy in which his ship was in, 12 ships, 10 of the ships got bombed and sunk on each side of him. He was one of the 2 ships that actually got through, heavily bombed, but miraculously got through to Jakarta, transshipped to another ship, and headed for India. His wife and children, meanwhile, were in Australia. And that's where he went. He was part of the war effort from the safety of Delhi, as the fighting occurred in Burma and all over that region. And because he spoke fluent Japanese, he just happened to have been born in Japan of British Anglican missionary parents, spoke fluent Japanese, loved the Japanese, didn't love what they did during the war, but he had a real soft spot for Japanese culture. He spoke to them once a week in beautiful Japanese, just addressing the truth. I feel emotion coming up just feeling it, because they had wives and sweethearts, and they didn't, just talking to them, propaganda, I suppose. But he was head of that section, and we joined him in India somewhere in the middle of the war, 1939, 44 or 43, when it was safe to cross the Indian Ocean.
We now fast forward in Graem Castell's memoir, Feet of Clay, to Chapter 2, Swinging London, May 1970.
What does your dad do then? The voice came from above. Were it not for the Cockney accent, the odd syntax, and the ignorance inherent in the question, it could have been God making a lame attempt at conversation. I'd stopped at a red light on London's Park Lane. A lorry had drawn up alongside me. The driver's ginger-haired arm dangled from the window, a fag lodged between the rows of his fingers. He was looking down into one of the most glorious convertibles ever built. At the wheel of the car below him was a young man with aviator sunglasses and a mop of beetle length hair, resplendent in a shot silk shirt and bright red trousers. Sprawled on the passenger seat on an old vicuna shawl was a bearded collie, dishevelled and pooped after a swim in the Serpentine. What the lorry driver was really asking was, what's a young toff, or tosser, poofter, wanker, or worse, like you, doing in a flash motor like that? I was still pondering the question when the lights changed to green. As I surged off, I pressed a button under the dash, and the plaintive bellowing moo of a Texas cow horn filled the air, echoing back from the buildings overlooking Hyde Park, no doubt startling everyone within earshot. I was 31 years old. Some 18 months earlier, I'd been scouring the Earl's Court Motor Show in search, as usual, of the ultimate supercar. There, in the midst of all the lights and chrome and scantily clad models, in the center of the red-carpeted Rolls-Royce and Bentley stand, outranking the Ferraris, Maseratis, Aston Martins, Porsches, and ridiculous Lamborghinis, was a Seychelles blue Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow 2 drop-head coupe. 2.5 supercharged tons of opulence. Its roof was down. Its 18 layers of hand-polished lacquer glistened. A white-gloved commissionaire unhooked the braided rope barrier surrounding the dais, and I mounted the shallow steps. I sauntered towards the car as casually as I could, wondering whether, still in my 20s, I looked old enough or affluent enough to be taken seriously by the crowd, let alone by the impeccable sales staff. I gazed down at the burled walnut of the fascia and door sills, the cream-colored leatherwork sewn from hides that had never been near a barbed wire fence, the crystal decanter and glasses visible behind a panel in the driver's door, the dark blue lambskin floor rugs, the double coach lines down each side of the car, so perfect that they must have been laid down mechanically, except that I knew that they'd been applied by a technician with a very long-haired brush and incredibly steady hand. A salesman, looking more like the manager of a Surrey country club, appeared at my elbow. He made a deferential opening remark, and I answered in a slightly strangulated voice, I'm looking for a replacement for my crappy Iso Grifo. That did it. Iso Grifos were the fastest production cars in the world, so-called Bertoni masterpieces custom built in Milan. They were rare. Mine was the only one I ever saw outside of a showroom, and most people have never heard of them. Beautiful though they were, however, they were less than perfect, and perfection was what I had in mind. I'd like one just like this, I said, gripping a windscreen pillar as if someone might elbow me aside. There was no indication of what it might cost. Well, sir, it'll take about 6 months to build, the salesman started. The chassis and engine will come from Crewe. The body will be built by Mullingar Park Ward. I cut in. Let's do whatever we need to do to make it happen.
I'm not an expert nor a real aficionado of cars, but I really love the detail which you still recall more than 50 years later. I asked you to tell a particular story, and before the final excerpt you're going to read from your memoir, Feet of Clay, a brief reveal here. In the early 80s, I was in Amsterdam at a talk given by Graem, and he told a story about how he woke up from his trance with opulence and transformed his life. I've never forgotten it. It comes in the middle of the book.
On Sunday, August the 1st, 1971, I flew from Heathrow to Bonn, at that time the capital of Germany, to have lunch with Monica. I would have used the Ferranti helicopter had it been available. Monica and I spent the afternoon walking arm in arm along the banks of the Rhine. She was wearing a crisp white blouse and pigskin slacks and was as ravishing as ever. That evening, I flew home. On the outward and homeward flights, I read and reread an alarming, admirably argued article in The Observer by Gerald Leach, the science correspondent. Entitled Spaceship Earth, it outlined many of the things likely to go wrong for the planet between then, 1971, and the turn of the century. Its opening lines were, "Many people now realize that Spaceship Earth is in some kind of trouble. What few appreciate with full imaginative force is how deep that trouble is. There's every indication that today's 3.6 billion passengers are rapidly overloading Earth into a series of breakdowns that the engineers will not be able to fix in time." The second half of the article appeared a week later. Its forecasts were as grim as those of the first. I was shocked to the core. It's not as if anyone reading that article had the benefit of the hindsight that we have now. We were faced, as mankind always is, with an unknown future. That Monday morning, I called friends, seeking their reactions. Their responses were disappointing. My first step was to determine the veracity or otherwise of the article. That took about 6 months. I have numerous quotes from famous men of the time, including U Thant, the United Nations longest-serving ever Secretary General, Edward Goldsmith of the Ecologist magazine, the German-born British economist E.F. Schumacher, author of Small is Beautiful, Olof Palme, Prime Minister of Sweden, and Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, France's president, and Dr. Henry Kissinger, the United States omnipresent Secretary of State, all painting pictures of impending collapse. For me, it was the jolting start of a 4-year-long transformative, awakening, enlightening process that would carry me into realms that I could never have imagined. Each of the radical steps that I took, 6 or 7 compulsions, as I call them, was as unlikely as the others. The first was to set in motion the founding of an intentional survivalist community, which rapidly morphed into a spiritually based one. Another, the colossal step lurking behind the others, was renunciation, to completely abandon my ultra-comfortable lifestyle, my Chelsea home, my businesses, my staff, everything, right down to the last penny of my wealth, and step into the void with no safety net in sight.
What did your family and your friends, how did they react to this extraordinary change in your, or hiatus in your life?
My father was long dead, wonderful man, and in one sense, that was a blessing because he couldn't, as it were, interfere with the process, which he might have been tempted to do. My mother lived just long enough to see me into the rather odd stage that Graeme was going through, but she'd already seen me go through odd stages, like opening a restaurant when I knew nothing about cooking or whatever. So, I mean, an idiotic thing to do, but that had been an incredible success. So maybe this next phase that Graeme was going through might equal. She was very, very good, wonderful at letting me have my head and lead my life right from childhood. And that's been absolutely one of the biggest blessings of my life.
What an extremely lucky and happy person you are to have had such rewarding relationships, not only with the people who worked with you, but also with your family members. What comes up for me, Graeme, is that, you know, today we are very aware of trauma. And you seem to me to be somebody who has coped. I mean, what you went through at such a young age and what your family went through. Can you explain, or do you understand how that has affected your life?
I go back to my mother. She was so secure and safe and validating and approving, and I was never ever punished, as far as I know, in my entire childhood. Not at school, not by my parents. Just punishment didn't come into it, and so with nothing to resist, I wasn't naughty. I did all sorts of exciting things.
Where do you think you got this desire to lead a different kind of life than most people led? I mean, you already were in some ways, but at that stage, you wouldn't have necessarily known that.
At 16 years old, wanted to sail my 12-foot little racing dinghy across the English Channel to France from our home on the East Suffolk coast of England. I mean, it'd be very easy for a parent to stamp on that pretty fast. I mean, what a silly idea, dying is very dangerous. You shouldn't be doing that, you know, and whatever. But my mother, very caring mother, didn't get in the way of that at all. So I sailed my little 12-foot racing dinghy, actually down the coast, up the Thames to London, under Tower Bridge, spent the night with my sleeping on the sidewalk pavement beside my boat to sort of protect it. Next morning, I sailed it down the Thames again, around the coast to Dover, and then across to France and back. And it was in the papers shortly after that. I didn't know about that. And it's just an adventure, but nobody interfered with that. I was unfettered. And it's the biggest blessing I think a child could possibly have. And it's the most unusual one. Most parents, bless them, for all the best reasons, are curbing their child there, punishing him a little there, checking on him here. Well, yeah, I can understand all of that, but I know the advantages of that not happening. So, my mother, full marks, okay?
We've caught a glimpse of the charmed and adventurous life Graem Castell has led. He's been reading from his upcoming memoir, Feet of Clay, and talking with me about the lightning transformations in 86 years living on planet Earth. This is Writers Radio, and I'm Ingrid Rose, host of the program Feet of Clay. My appreciation for my co-host and co-producers Carol Harmon and Gary Sill, who is also our music and technical expert. And appreciation to you too, our listeners, for listening.
You have been listening to Writers Radio, a non-commercial collaborative project which presents talented writers reading their own work. These stories, essays, and conversations revisit the long tradition of oral storytelling that connects us to the inspiration behind the words. Be sure to check the website, writersradio.ca, to subscribe to our free notifications list. It's also a way of letting the writers know you are there and appreciating their creative work.
Writers Radio broadcasts from Half Moon Bay on the Sunshine Coast in Canada, traditional tribal land of the Sechelt Nation of the Coast Salish peoples. We express our gratitude for their wisdom teachings and land stewardship.